Israel has strictly remained neutral in the hostilities between Russia and Ukraine since they started, which was well before the current conflict in Ukraine started nearly a year ago. This might be about to alter. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has made a special effort to court the Israeli government ever since he took office at the end of 1999. He made sure to meet the Israeli prime minister at least once a year, typically at one of his homes in Sochi or Moscow, and every few years he would go to Jerusalem. Putin respects strength and sees Israel as a strong country with which he wants to be on good terms, a former Russian diplomat told me. The same is true of Israel's leaders, particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, who served as prime minister for the longest period of time, before being re-elected at the end of 2022. In 2019, Netanyahu used pictures of them together as part of his election campaign, because he was so proud of what he claimed to be a close relationship with Putin. He has asserted repeatedly that their partnership was advantageous for Israel's strategic goals. One example of this was when Russia sent its military to war-torn Syria for the first time in September 2015, in order to support President Bashar Assad's bloody regime. Within a few days, Netanyahu was leading a military delegation to Moscow for an impromptu meeting with Putin. The two leaders came to an agreement that Israel would keep flying over Syrian airspace, but would only attack Iranian targets, and leave Assad's forces alone. It didn't take long to set up a deconfliction mechanism that included a hotline between the Russian command center in Syria and the Air Force headquarters in Israel. Following the victory of the former prime minister's right-wing alliance in this month's election, Benjamin Netanyahu walks during a ceremony where Israel President Isaac Herzog hands him the authority to form a new government on November 13, 2022, at the president's residence in Jerusalem. Senior Israeli officials have made a point of stressing over the years that, even though the United States remains Israel's primary strategic ally, coordination with the Russians must be maintained. Israel declined to join the Western governments in 2014, and denouncing Russia's annexation of Crimea, despite pressure from Washington. All throughout, strict neutrality was to be upheld. Netanyahu was not in office on February 24 of last year, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Naftali Bennett served as prime minister and upheld the neutrality stance. "We are not in the same position as other countries," Bennett told me. "Russia is just across our border in Syria. We must take into account the sizable Jewish populations that exist in both Russia and Ukraine, and could be harmed. Additionally, having a government like Israel, which enjoys good relations with both sides, to act as a go-between is beneficial for everyone." Bennett set out on a peace mission in the early stages of the conflict, visiting Putin in the Kremlin, and speaking with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky several times. There was a 50% chance of reaching a ceasefire. Sadly it failed, he insists. Additionally, he asserts that by getting involved, local truces could be negotiated quickly to allow for the rescue of civilians from the conflict area. Any chance of a ceasefire has long since disappeared, and Ukraine has since publicly asked Israel to assist in arming it, particularly with Iron Dome missile defense systems. Israel has provided aid, but has declined to provide any weapons. Israel has agreed to supply Kiev as a result of Russia's recent use of Iranian drones to attack Ukrainian targets. The Israeli government's top officials did not all support Bennett's impartial stance. Yair Lapid, his political rival and the country's former foreign minister, was more outspoken in his public denunciation of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The nation's security establishment was split on opinions as well. "The fear of Russia is overblown," an Israeli general told me, and Israel could have been much more supportive of Ukraine without any fear of retaliation. Netanyahu regained his position in government 10 months after the Russian invasion. He was suddenly much less cordial with Putin. The week before his inauguration, he only made one congratulatory phone call to him. Meanwhile, he has stated in media interviews that he is rethinking Israel's approach to the Ukraine war, though he would not give any details. "The fear of Russia is overblown," an Israeli general told me, and Israel could have been much more supportive of Ukraine without any fear of retaliation. According to a former Israeli intelligence officer who was heavily involved in Israel's military alliance with Russia, Netanyahu has two immediate reasons for changing policy and supporting Ukraine. First, due to their need in Ukraine, Russia has significantly reduced the size of its forces in Syria. "They no longer pose a significant threat to Israel," the officer declared. Second, Russia is now employing Iranian drones and missiles on the front lines, and Israel now has a crucial opportunity to provide Ukraine with defense systems, so we can assess how well they perform in a real conflict. The officer continued, "We might eventually encounter the same Iranian weapons." Another justification for Netanyahu to think about bolstering his support for Ukraine comes from an Israeli diplomat. The Biden administration has already expressed its displeasure with the new government's plans for a legal overhaul, which significantly weakened the powers and independence of Israel's Supreme Court. In contrast to the Bennett-Lapid government, his new coalition of far-right and ultra-religious parties is viewed with suspicion by this administration. In contrast to previous visits, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did not extend the Prime Minister an invitation to the White House during his most recent trip to Jerusalem. Netanyahu's best chance of winning over Washington may be an Israeli pivot toward Kyiv.